The following segment is a mock debate produced for educational purposes only. The views expressed during the episode represent neither the official opinions of the Institute of International Relations and its researchers, nor the debate participants.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of Podcast.IA, the podcast for the Center of Russia, Eurasia and Southeastern Europe of the Institute of International Relations. My name is Pavlos Karagiannodimas and I will be the host for this episode. Here with me are Stamatina Somaraki.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Panagiota Chatzilymperi.
Thank you all for meeting you again.
Klimis Katsiavrias.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, Theoni Griva.
Hello everyone, thank you again for being here.
Before we start our debate, we would like to reiterate that today's discussion is a mock debate produced for educational purposes. The views which will be shared later do not represent the official opinions of the Institute of International Relations and its researchers. Additionally, these views do not necessarily reflect the actual views of any of the debate participants. With that said, today's topic: should the European Union have an independent military and defense policy independent from NATO? For the first round, we begin with Klimis Katsiavrias.
Today I stand before you to advocate for the establishment of a European Union centralized defense policy autonomous from NATO. It is essential to recognize that the world has changed dramatically since the inception of NATO, and as such, the need for a more cohesive and agile European defense mechanism has become increasingly apparent. First and foremost, the evolving geopolitical landscape calls for a unified European defense policy. The rise of new powers, such as China, and the resurgence of an assertive Russia compel us to evaluate our strategic priorities. By adopting a centralized defense policy, the EU would possess a more efficient and coherent decision-making process, thus enabling it to respond to emerging threats and challenges with greater speed and efficiency. Second, a centralized EU defense policy would foster deeper cooperation and integration among member states, which in turn would lead to improved resource allocation, interoperability, and burden sharing. By pooling and sharing resources, member states can collectively achieve economies of scale, allowing for the development and procurement of more advanced military capabilities. This would essentially enable the EU to better defend its territory and uphold its values on the global stage, while reducing our reliance on NATO and the United States. Moreover, the establishment of a centralized EU defense policy would provide an opportunity to build on the success of existing initiatives, such as the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, and the European Defence Fund, EDF. By streamlining these initiatives under a single framework, the EU could enhance its strategic autonomy, enabling it to pursue its objectives independently and with greater confidence. Furthermore, a more robust European defense policy would facilitate the development of a shared strategic culture, reflecting the EU's unique historical, political, and social context. As such, a centralized EU defense policy would embody the interests and values of its member states, ensuring that their voices are heard on the international stage.
Thank you very much for your arguments, Klimis. And now we continue with Theoni.
Thank you, Pavlos. The discussion around European strategic autonomy is a lively one, and surely the ongoing war in Ukraine has thrown the debate under the spotlight once again when it comes to European security. Europe is reliant and indeed dependent on the American defense industry for its security. This is a fair and factual observation, not because the European industry is unable to produce quality weapons and systems, but because Europe made the political choice to rely on the US decades ago. but the indoor disagreements are indicative of greater schism in EU foreign, security and defense policy. Member states with markedly different orientations and priorities have unsurprisingly failed to generate a cogent vision for their foreign, security and defense policy. Incremental progress over 2 decades has not generated the capabilities Europe needs to defend itself, let alone to play a more expansive, independent role in world affairs. Even if Europeans could conjure up a cohesive path to strategic autonomy, they shouldn't take it. Breaking from the United States would require the militarization of the European Union to the extent that it would become unrecognizable. The Union would lose its identity as a values-driven and creative geopolitical player and instead begin to resemble a classical great power with a regressive realist worldview. Neither, though, is this only about interests. EU member states still share values to a far greater extent with the United States than they do, for example, with China. Standing idly on the sidelines of any new Cold War is not a credible option, and doing so would fundamentally damage the European Union in moral terms.
Thank you very much, Theoni, for your arguments as well. And with that, the first round is over. We will now continue the second round of arguments, and we will begin with Stamatina. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavlos. As much as it may seem rational to agree on a division of labor between the EU and NATO based on their strengths, it would not work. It would require both parties giving up some tasks, and for organizations like the EU and NATO, that would mean foregoing alternatives and becoming less flexible in their approaches and action. It will also push NATO and the EU further apart from one another, decreasing the overlap that has benefited them.
Thank you very much, Stamatina, for your arguments as well. And now we will continue with Panagiota.
Thank you, Pavlos. European strategic autonomy is the doctrine of French foreign policy developed under the Macron administration. The aim is to make the European Union strategically autonomous vis-à-vis China and the United States. At the current time, the US and China have found themselves in the midst of a competitive race, and Europe does not have the material and ideological reserves to outflank them. Already, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions on Russia, and the turmoil on the African continent have led to a forced change in European policy priorities. The future is uncertain. The European Union must find its way in an international system where the facts are constantly changing. Autonomy in foreign policy is a doctrine that characterizes French strategy. Recognizing that France is part of the West, this country and its foreign policy tries to operate in the international system as an actor of logic and diplomacy, without relying on the imaginary narratives that can structure confrontations. The Pacific Ocean is an area of interest for France, so it has a comprehensive picture of the balance of power in the region. The European Union itself as an international power based on trade and cultural diplomacy through economic and logistical support programs. Thus, it is in the European interest to organize an autonomous strategy, such as how to react to the Taiwan issue, in order to promote a policy of appeasement and avoid situations leading to a flammable crisis.
Thank you very much, Panagiota, for your arguments as well. And with that, the second round is over. Now we will continue to our third and final round, started with Klimis. Klimis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pavlos. It is important to clarify that advocating for an autonomous EU defense policy does not imply the abandonment of NATO wholesale. Instead, this would allow for a more balanced and complementary partnership, as the EU would be able to contribute more effectively to the collective security of the transatlantic alliance. By establishing a more robust and self-reliant European defense mechanism, the EU would not only strengthen its own security, but also reinforce NATO's capability to address global challenges, In conclusion, I think that the establishment of a European Union centralized defense policy, autonomous from NATO, but complementary to it, is an essential step towards enhancing the EU strategic autonomy, promoting deeper cooperation among its member states and navigating the rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. It is a forward-looking and necessary endeavor to safeguard the EU's interests and values, ultimately contributing to a more secure, prosperous, and just world. And with that, I give the floor to my partner.
Thank you, Clemens, for your very interesting argument. Yes, I agree with my colleague because Europe has to create an autonomy policy, especially in diplomatic terms. As the Europeans, we enter in a new phase in international politics, and the European Union must not depend only in the USA politics, because sometimes the American administration, such as under Trump presidency, may retreat for its obligation. So the interest of the European Union is to create an autonomy strategic policy.
Thank you very much for your arguments. And with that said, I now give the floor to Stamatina for your final arguments as well.
Thank you once again, Pavlos. The EU sees NATO as the foundation of the collective defense of its members. The EU is a political union and to a considerable extent a supranational entity that has competencies that previously belonged to the member states. This is the union's strength. The alliance recognizes the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense, complementary and mutually reinforcing roles, and strategic partnership. In fact, what needs to be done is both organizations to strengthen their partnerships. And now I will give the floor to my partner, Theoni.
Thank you, Stamatina. I agree, of course, with you, since the EU wants to become the European leg of NATO. So, someone will ask, where would they leave key non-EU European members of NATO, such as the UK, Norway, and Turkey? In any case, the EU countries can't even agree among themselves. The most profound case against a single EU army comes back to the degree to which the nations of Europe wish to retain their national independence. The EU is a hybrid organization where governments have handed over certain powers to the EU Commission. At this moment, EU defense and military matters are still largely in the hands of member country governments who can exercise a veto. Even more important, however, is honesty. Without the United States, Europe will not be able to defend itself territorially, effectively deterring authoritarian superpowers such as Russia or China on all levels: hybrid, conventional, tactical nuclear, and strategic nuclear. Last but not least, what the EU really needs is one thing: strategic responsibility. And that means responsibility vis-à-vis its own citizens, Eastern partners, and its allies across the Atlantic.
Well, with that said, we have finished with the third and final round, and now our debate is over. I would like to once again thank all of the participants. I would like to thank Stamatina.
Thank you too, Pavlos.
I would like to thank Klimis.
Thank you for being such a great host.
I would like to thank Panagiota.
It was a very interesting debate with many interesting arguments and a wonderful hosting from Pavlos. I think many people will know better about these complicated terms.
And finally, I would like to thank Theoni.
Thank you, Pavlos, again. I have to congratulate you for the great hosting and all the colleagues. It was a very interesting conversation about the relations of the EU and NATO, that it is a matter that no one knows very well.
Thank you very much, everyone, also for tuning in to Podcast.IA, the podcast for the Center of Russia, Eurasia, and Southeastern Europe for the Institute of International Relations. And we'll see you in the next episode.